Virgin Most Powerful Radio, sharing the gospel with clarity and charity.
And now, Virgin Most Powerful Radio is pleased to present Hands-On Apologetics with renowned Catholic author and apologist, Gary Michuta.
Welcome, everybody. Hands-On Apologetics. You have entered into Virgin Most Powerful's Apologetics Dojo, and it's great to be with you today. I am your host and sensei, Gary Michuta, as we dive into this thing we call apologetics, where we learn how to explain, defend the faith with clarity, charity, and confidence. Great to be with you today, and, got a great show in store for us. But before I lay out what's going on in the show, I just wanted to just pass along that I really appreciate the Beams. Arthur and Teresa Beam, they were on yesterday. Fortunately, we had some technical problems, but they nevertheless did a fantastic job talking about the Millerite movement and how that flows into Adventism and how we can learn a lot from the mistakes of the past. And also learn a lot about how to approach people like members of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, which is a very difficult group to evangelize. So I just wanted to give a special thank you to them for bearing with us, and you could check out their videos. They got some great videos on YouTube at Arthur and Teresa Beam, or you could even type in Sunbeam. So many thanks to them. Wish we had the full hour, because that was going to be a really fascinating discussion. But nevertheless, what we did talk about was fantastic. And talking about fantastic discussions, we're going to have a fantastic discussion today, because we're going to have the guy who started it all in Catholic apologetics here in the United States, at least started the modern Catholic apologetic movement. Karl Keating is going to be joining us, founder of Catholic Answers, prolific author, and he's been coming on the show once a month, and we're diving into Catholic apologetic classics. You know, there are so many gems out there, just incredible works of apologetics, history, theology, that's just collecting dust on shelves in libraries. And people just don't know about these classics. And so what we want to do is every month we're going to blow the dust off one of these classic books that really deserve to be read and cherished. And today's book is going to be by the great Catholic apologist Frank Sheeds, and the book is Faith Comes by Hearing. So Karl Keating is going to be coming on. We're going to talk about Frank Sheeds, talk about his work, and, there'll be one more weapon in your arsenal of apologetic weapons, just becoming familiar with these great classic works. So he'll be coming up on the other side of the break. Also, as always, every episode, we look at a critical thinking skill, develop our critical thinking. Today's Finding the Fallacy could very easily slip into a propaganda technique. It's called Misleading Vividness. And that's an interesting fallacy. We also are going to meet an early church father. Today's early church father is St. Prosper of Aquitaine. So, got great stuff in store for us today. Excuse me. So without further ado, why don't I give my shout-outs and welcomes to all of you in the dojo, virtually speaking, in our social media section. I want to say hi to all of you over there on our social media section. Hi, everybody watching live stream, YouTube, Facebook, all the other platforms. Welcome aboard, folks. Also, I want to welcome all of you listening on radio around the country and also via podcast around the world. And certainly, we truly, truly appreciate you listening to the program. Love your feedback. And as always, please share, like, and if you haven't, subscribe, because that helps our mission to do this work of evangelism, make Jesus better known and loved around the world. And just by clicking your mouse, you can make that happen. So we truly appreciate it. If you go on social media, tell people about Hands-On Apologetics, tell people about Virgin Most Powerful Radio, share, like, And especially if you know somebody who is looking for a good book to read, this may be a program that you would want to share with them. So, yeah, let's see. Anything else? Oh, yeah, as always, I want to tell you about this new project I have. I'm actually working on something very interesting. It's probably going to be one of the most explosive things I do. I opened up a channel on YouTube called the Apocrypha Apocalypse. If you haven't checked it out, please. And also, subscribe, whatever. I'm unrolling video after video where we're revealing things about the so-called Apocrypha, these books that Protestants reject. They're part of Catholic and Orthodox Bibles. And I'm actually working on a video right now where I'm showing how Martin Luther flip-flopped on the issue of the Deuterocanon. I'm actually going into primary source material. It's going to be very interesting when it's released, and it could be potentially explosive, and that's why I want to ask you all, if you could, just check it out and kind of help boost the visibility so that when this video is eventually published, it will make an impact and hopefully be yet another argument to call our separated brethren back into communion with the church. So many thanks for all those who are willing to do that. I truly, truly appreciate it. Without further ado, why don't we jump into the Finding the Fallacy? Like I said, today's Finding the Fallacy is a very interesting one. It's misleading vividness. It's when we use faulty logic to make an argument, it's called a logical fallacy. And one type of logical fallacy is a misleading vividness, when someone uses a small number of dramatic events to claim that something is more prevalent than it actually is based on statistics. And this is also known, by the way, as the anecdotal fallacy. As you know, there's a lot of AKAs when it comes to fallacies. We encounter this all the time, and we, especially during political campaign seasons, where a few examples are taken that are very compelling, very vivid, but are extremely rare. And they're presented, but their vividness makes it appear as if the problem is huge, when in fact, statistically, it's quite small. And you could go issue after issue after issue and come up with examples of this. Somebody will make a proposal, and then the opposite party will trot out certain people who have very, heart-wrenching and compelling stories about how they're injured. But what's missed in these stories that people buy into is the fact that these stories are incredibly rare, and that perhaps the bill, although it may permit some suffering for a very small percentage of people, if it wasn't passed, it would increase suffering for everybody, right? So it's kind of a distortion of perspective where vividness replaces the actual size and scope of the problem. And like I said, I think this is very, very prevalent in the field of politics. It's certainly a little bit there in advertising. It's also there in terms of apologetics, usually with things like the Inquisition or the Crusades or something, or Jan Hus. That's another good example, where something vivid and compelling and certainly tantalizing, right? But it's taken out of context, so that the sensational stories about torture in the Inquisition is kind of put in a garish light without any perspective given to how that compares to the rest of society at that time. And what you find actually is many times the acts of the Inquisition was much more fair and humane than those in secular courts. But nevertheless, it's the vividness that kind of causes that distortion. So be aware of this. Very important fallacy. And now let's jump to the Meet the Early Church Father for today, shall we? Who is St. Prosper of Aquitaine. Not much is known about St. Prosper of Aquitaine, and even of the little, most of it's gleaned from his own writings. He was a monk in Marseille, but not a clerical orders. He's a friend of Hilary of Poitiers, who wrote a letter, which was letter 226 in the corpus of Augustine's letters. But unlike Hilary, he had no personal acquaintance with St. Augustine. So we know practically nothing about him personally. Soon after Augustine's death in August of 430, Prosper and Hilary went in person to Rome, where they asked Pope Celestine I to issue a formal condemnation of a heresy known as semi-Pelagianism, which they called Misleading, after the city of Marseille. Celestus did issue a letter to the bishops of Gaul, that is France, generally commending St. Augustine, but he did not condemn semi-Pelagianism and only enjoined a silence upon the disputed points. So beginning in 432 AD, Prosper himself commenced to drift away from the strictest interpretation of Augustinian theology. He no longer held to the predestination of damnation that is prior to any foreknowledge of man's deserts. He did continue to see, however, that the roots of the Pelagian and semi-Pelagian errors is in the teaching that is central to them, namely the thesis that grace is given to men in accord with their merits. When Leo the Great became Bishop of Rome in 440 AD, Prosper came down again from Gaul and was given a post in the papal chancellery. According to Grenadinius of Marseille, it was Prosper who drafted certain letters of Pope Leo against Eutyches and the Monophysitism, and Prosper cannot be found alive after 455 AD. And that's our early church father for today, St. Prosper of Aquitaine. Coming up on the other side of the break, the great one, Karl Keating, and we're going to talk about Frank Sheeds' work, Faith Comes by Hearing. Stay tuned.
Jesus said to the apostles in Luke chapter 10, "Whoever listens to you listens to me, and whoever rejects you rejects me." According to St. Boniface, in her voyage across the ocean of this world, the Church is like a great ship being pounded by the waves of life's different stresses. Our duty is not to abandon ship, but to keep her on course. May our Lord help us remain ever faithful to His Church, to aid and defend her.
Did you know my mom's gonna have a baby?
She is? Will it be a boy? Or will it be a girl?
We don't know yet, but we heard the heartbeat and my dad said this is gonna be someone very special.
You mean like being a president? Or maybe a doctor?
Well, probably maybe like a singer or dancer, I think.
Hello, my name is Marianne Koharski. I'm the director of Pro-Life Across America. We know that every baby is a miracle and has the potential to do great things. If you know someone who is pregnant or in need of alternatives or assistance, or would like to support the work of Pro-Life Across America, please call 1-800-366-7773 or visit our website at prolifeacrossamerica.org. Pro-Life Across America is non-political and totally educational.
This is Terry Barber. I want to thank you for your support here at Virgin Most Powerful Radio. Here's an easy way to do it. If you're going to sell or buy a house, call Real Estate for Life, 877-543-3871, because they're going to get you a Christ-centered agent to purchase your home or to sell your home. And at the close of escrow, a portion of his commission goes right back to Virgin Most Powerful Radio. Call 877-543-3871. Thank you so much for your support.
Now, back to Hands-On Apologetics with Gary Machuda. If you'd like to join the conversation, call 888-526-2151. Here's Gary.
And welcome back, everybody, to Hands-On Apologetics. And we're going to discuss one of those great Catholic apologetic classics that perhaps maybe is sitting on your own bookshelf, but you haven't read it for a while. And so we're going to give you some reasons to read it. And if you don't have it, perhaps pick it up. And the person to help us do that is the great Karl Keating. Karl Keating, of course, is the founder of Catholic Answers. He's a prolific author. He's written over 16 books, such as Catholicism Fundamentalism, Debating Catholicism series, Book for Life, No Apology. He also writes in several genres. And you could check out his great stuff at karlkeating.com, or just go to Amazon, type in his name, and you can see all the great things that he has produced. And Karl, welcome back to Hands-On Apologetics.
Gary, it's good to be with you again, as always. Thank you.
Yes, and especially to talk about, I know we both love this author, Frank Sheed.
Indeed, yeah. Undoubtedly the top Catholic apologist of the 20th century, at least in the English-speaking world. I think probably in the whole world.
Yeah, wow. And that's high praise, because he, in many ways, he kind of pioneered, at least on a lay level, Catholic apologetics in England with the Catholic Truth Society.
That's right. And then, of course, Sheed, who was Australian by birth, lived not only in England for many years, but also in the U.S., So he brought his skills over to this side of the Atlantic also.
Yeah, and his background too. I always found that really fascinating. That it was he was part of the Speakers Guild, and so he really honed his craft on how to explain, defend the faith in front of an audience, and how to keep their attention.
And the Catholic Evidence Guild was especially active from the 1920s through the 1940s. And every weekend they would set up what was called a pitch or a platform at Speaker's Corner in Hyde Park in London. And at the same time, there'd be dozens of other organizations having their own pitches in the area. So next one over might be a Protestant fundamentalist. The next one over might be an atheist. Next one over might be somebody pushing vegetarianism or what have you. So the task of the speakers at the Catholic place was, first of all, to gather a crowd, and then to keep the crowd, and then third, to convince the crowd of the truth of the faith. So there was a lot of skill at different levels that needed to be acquired for one to be a successful speaker there. And Sheed certainly was a successful speaker.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, because you have to hold the audience, their attention, and also handle hecklers, and also cover the points very simply and clearly. And I think of all the writers that I'm familiar with, he is perhaps one of the best in terms of clarity, especially with difficult topics.
Yes. Exactly. Yes. Matter of fact, let me just mention one anecdote before we leave Speaker's Corner.
Okay.
When Sheed first was there and got up on the pitch to speak as a junior speaker, he had been preceded by a woman speaker who had gathered quite a large crowd. And Sheed got up there and began to speak whatever his topic was, and the crowd drifted away. So the woman got him down. She got up, and she started her talk again, and the crowd came back, and she got back up again. And then he lost the crowd once more. And the woman went up a third time and kept the crowd. And Sheed was off to the side looking. He said, "I was so impressed with her that I married her." That was Maisie Ward.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah, so Frank Sheed, Maisie Ward, founders of the Sheed and Ward Publishing House, which for so many decades was the top Catholic publisher in the U.S. and in Britain.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, they published a lot of great stuff for a number of years. Are they still in business?
Yes, in name only, because what happened, I think it was in the late 60s, Frank sold the company to the company that ended up owning the National Catholic Reporter, the liberal newspaper. Okay. And that publishing house kept the name as an imprint, but of course the stuff it printed under the name had bore no relation to what Frank and Maisie used to publish.
Yeah.
So if you find Sheed and Ward labeled books from, say, the 1970s, at least the 1980s onward, they'd be mainly liberal claptrap. But if you find them prior to the mid-60s, then Frank and Maisie were still in charge, and the stuff is all good.
Yeah. Well, that clears up a mystery because looking at Sheed and Ward books at used bookstores, things like that, I always noticed that it was strange because they would have really good, solid Orthodox books, and then they'd have books that's like, really? They're publishing this?
Yeah, I don't know what drove them to sell to the National Catholic Reporter people. Maybe they were in tight financial straits and they were made a good offer, but it was still an unfortunate decision because it basically ruined the name of the company after that. Because people in the know who had known, and who had relied on Sheed and Ward books for decades. Because it got to the point where if Sheed and Ward came out with something new, just order it because you know it was going to be good, not just orthodox, but actually a well-written book. Yeah. And then after it was sold off, and it when the publishing house went in a different direction, it was very unfortunate.
Yeah, absolutely.
But the book we're talking about today, though, is one that was published before the problems. And as a matter of fact, it's one of the last ones, probably one of the last ones before Frank and Maisie sold the publishing house. And that's a book called Faith Comes by Hearing by Frank Sheed.
Yeah, and this is one of the Frank Sheed books I'm ashamed to say this, but I've never read. So I'm looking forward to your assessment of it. I knew it was a later book.
Yeah, it came out in 1967.
Okay.
And Frank indicates at the beginning, this is really a sequel to Catholic Evidence Training Outlines, which you and I have talked about on this program before, and we've mentioned many times in various broadcasts. I mentioned in my sort of quasi-autobiography, Book for Life, I mentioned that Catholic Evidence Training Outlines was the most influential book I read in terms of becoming an apologist. It's a wonderful book. It's still in print.
Yeah.
And I had the second edition from 1948. I think the first edition came out, I don't know if it was the late 20s or early 30s. I don't think I've ever actually come across a copy of it. But the Catholic Evidence Training Outlines literally were the outlines used to train Catholic Evidence Guild speakers. And the whole book is in outline format. And it covers basically everything that might be a topic. If you were in that public speaker's corner speaking mode in London, it covers anything that you might be asked by anybody, whether Catholic or non-Catholic. This is an excellent book. But about 2 decades later then, she writes, Faith Comes by Hearing, because he said, as he says in this book, which is very much thinner, it's only 175 pages or so, so about half the length. But he says in here that things had changed enough that he needed to indicate what those changes were. Changes in the public approach to religion in general, to Catholicism in particular. Much of this book, though, I have to say, is actually pretty closely, not always word for word, pretty closely taken from portions of Catholic Evidence Training Outlines, but there's much of it that's fresh.
Okay. Yeah, so, especially, was it 67? Yeah, there was lots of major changes in culture and so on. So he decided to update it in terms of the new approaches to the questions of religion?
Yeah. Early on he says, talking about the Catholic speaker in front of a crowd, he says, the Catholic then faces a crowd not deeply interested. It may retain a hostility to Catholicism, but a hostility from which all the sap has been drained out. I remember going back to the Catholic Evidence Training Outlines. That book was largely in terms of responding to the traditional Protestant attack on the church, the kind of thing that I dealt with in Catholicism and fundamentalism, where you had the attacks coming from people who were devout Christians of another sort and who thought deeply about controverted issues and thought the Catholic Church was wrong and even pernicious because of that. But now, Sheed is saying here in 1967, the crowd has changed. The audience has changed. Most of the people are simply not interested in those old controversies, at least not in the same way. They still have a hostility toward Catholicism, but it's not based on the doctrinal writings of Luther or Calvin or Zwingli. Okay, it's a kind of different thing, and we need to understand what that thing is if we're going to approach these people.
Yeah, good point. So that's interesting. So it wasn't objections rooted in Reformation writings, but rather it's just the hostilities there, just the bulwark of doctrine, or what do I want to say, substance is gone.
She goes on to say in the same paragraph, they do not hate the church as an enemy of God, which is a mistaken but very stimulating view, nor as a teacher of false doctrines. What they have is simply a mistrustful feeling that they do not quite know what she is at, and that her existence somehow comports a threat to their own individual and national liberty. And if we were to come, from 1967 to today, 53 years later, what we could say is that even compared to what I just read, the hostility to the church is even less doctrinal, but now it's moral rather than doctrinal. But for a lot of people, they don't even realize it's at that level. But there's a hostility there that's deep-seated. And, this is something we've always seen in America. The historian Arthur Schlesinger Sr. said many decades ago that anti-Catholicism is the anti-Semitism of the liberal. So the liberals in America who despise the Catholic Church, their despising of it is similar to the way other people, anti-Semites, look towards Jews.
Interesting. Well, we're chatting with Karl Keating about the classic work, Frank Sheeds' Faith Comes by Hearing. More to come on the other side of the break. You're listening to Hands on Apologetics, and we'll be right back.
Hi, this is Jesse Romero from the Terry and Jesse Show, also from Jesus 911. Let's face it, we all need to use the internet, but we need screen accountability. Why? Pornography is a huge problem, especially on the internet. And every time we tap into the internet, we get bombarded with images and temptations that degrade our humanity. So we need Covenant Eyes to block these pornographic sites and advertisements from infiltrating our lives. Covenant Eyes helps us take custody of our eyes and custody of our intellect. So I recommend you go to covenanteyes.com and type in the promo code VMPR to support the network. Protect yourself and your family from the imminent threats on the internet. www.covenanteyes.com, code VMPR, live porn free. Thank you for listening to Virgin Most Powerful Radio. Thank you. God bless you. Keep the faith.
Jesus said to the apostles in Luke chapter 10, "Whoever listens to you listens to me, and whoever rejects you rejects me." According to St. Boniface, in her voyage across the ocean of this world, the church is like a great ship being pounded by the waves of life's different stresses, our duty is not to abandon ship, but to keep her on course. May our Lord help us remain ever faithful to His church, to aid and defend her.
Buying or selling your home or your business property? This is Terry Barber. Real Estate for Life underwrites the Terry and Jesse Show, and they can connect you to one of 900 pro-life real estate agents around the world. And when they receive their referral fee, they will give 80% of it to a pro-life organization. Wow! That's 80%! realestateforlife.org, 877-LIFE-US1.
This is Jesse Romero. You're listening to Hands-On Apologetics with Gary Machuda on Virgin Most Powerful Radio.
And welcome back, everybody. We're chatting with Karl Keating about the classic work by Frank Sheed, Faith Comes by Hearing. Karl, you made two really fascinating observations right before the break. How things had changed from opposing Catholicism as an opponent of religious truth to more of a threat to personal autonomy. And then you mentioned also this kind of parallel where in America where anti-Catholicism is kind of like the liberals' anti-Semitism. I'd love if you could maybe expound on both of those.
Well, the second, as I mentioned, the line comes from Arthur Schlesinger Sr., the father of Arthur Schlesinger Jr. Some people might remember him as the court historian in the John F. Kennedy administration back in the 60s.
Right.
So, but and he was a historian too, but his father was a better one. But the elder man is looking at the long history in the U.S. of anti-Catholicism. For example, in the 1850s, there was a political party with a strange popular name of the Know Nothing Party, and its core was against Catholicism. It didn't want Catholics to come to the U.S. And we all know about the Ku Klux Klan, but what many people don't realize is that it began as an explicitly anti-Catholic organization, only later became an anti-Black organization. So anti-Catholicism has been around a long time, really, from the first in the U.S. But it's been a respectable kind of prejudice where anti-Semitism, prejudice against Jews, has not been respectable. And of course, neither one should be respectable. But anti-Catholicism was considered sort of respectable for political liberals, and that's what Schlesinger was saying. And so we've had that as a kind of backdrop throughout American history, and we need to be looking at that in current events. Nowadays, in political areas, that comes out where Catholic candidates or nominees for courtships, judgeships, and so on, or if they're Catholic, there's a prejudice against them immediately. Now, partly that's on the abortion issue, but not just that. There's a prejudice in certain quarters against them simply because they're Catholic. If they had been Muslim or Presbyterian or agnostic, and otherwise held the same opinions, there would not be that prejudice. So anti-Catholicism is a background thing, kind of like the buzz of insects in the background. It's always there. Sometimes you don't notice it, but it's always there. And so that was one of the things that Sheed, in this book, was saying we have to deal with nowadays. In the older days, a lifetime ago, let's say, anti-Catholicism was most explicit with believing conservative Protestants who complained about Catholic doctrines. And so we could have an argument or discussion with them on the basis of doctrine. And, a lot of good could come from that. And I've had many such discussions as you have over the years, and we both know that the good comes for both sides in those kinds of discussions, and often conversions to the faith. But now, more recently, again, Sheed is writing 53 years ago, so it's all the more true today. Yes. We have a different problem, and let me give you another quote from his book. He said, the things that were matters of controversy a few decades ago. He said these things make no impress on their minds at all, for there is nothing already there with which they may come into contact. If the crowd is to be interested in a doctrine now, it must be by the intrinsic interest of the doctrine, not by the quite extrinsic fact that non-Catholics used to fight about it. What this means is that we used to be able to gather crowds, certainly back in Sheeds' time, but even, in my years as an apologist, you could gather crowds by throwing out a topic that's controverted between Catholics and Protestants, say, or between Catholics and atheists. Mm-hmm. And you could have a discussion about that. But now, and at that point, you start discussing the controversy. But now you can't really do that. You got to discuss, you got to explain what the controversy is about, the underlying doctrine. For example, she goes on to say that if, say, we want to be talking with an atheist about the existence of God, 9/10 of what we do, what we should be doing, is not what used to be done, which is to maybe discuss the 5 proofs of Aquinas and so on. 9/10 of what we have to do now is to explain what we mean by God, because the atheist of the modern time doesn't have that picture in his mind of what we're actually talking about. And that's true then really of any Catholic doctrine. Mm-hmm. We have to spend most of the time simply explaining what it is we mean by the doctrine before we start to argue about it, before we start to try to prove it. And this is something I noticed a long time ago. And it occurred to me, I mentioned the 5 proofs that Aquinas. I've never come across anybody who transitioned from atheism to Christianity because of one of those proofs. And I don't think Aquinas ever intended those proofs to be used in that way. Rather, I think what happens is that people, for other reasons, become theists or Christians or even Catholics. And then they go back to these proofs and read them, and they're confirmations of the truth of Christianity. But they don't bring you into Christianity themselves. Mm. But there used to be a time in dealing with atheists that Catholics and other Christians thought they had to talk in terms of such proofs. That's the proof from contingency and so forth. But I think it's the case that really nobody, at least in modern times, or almost nobody, has become a theist and has left atheism because of those arguments. They do it so for other reasons, and those arguments confirm the rightness and the intelligence of what they've done after the fact. But they're not the things that actually move them over.
Interesting. Yeah, and I my experience bears that out, that what Sheeds saying is true, that many times you have to start with explaining why something is important, why they should care about what you're saying, and then discuss what your, whatever the topic is. And that was in the 60s. Yeah. It's more true today.
Right. But you're what you just said is the key point. You have to explain to people why the thing you want to talk about is important to them.
Yeah.
The man who doesn't know he should be concerned about salvation is not going to be open to hearing an argument about how you get saved. He needs to know that he needs to be saved. What is salvation anyway? Sheed says here, this is I think an excellent line that ought to be posted on everybody's wall. Proof is always wasted on a man who is not interested in the question. Mm. So if we don't get somebody interested in what we're talking about, it doesn't matter how we prove it, how clever we are in our discussions. Mm-hmm. Because if he doesn't care about the question, he doesn't care about the answer to it. He doesn't care about the proof. So if a man doesn't see why it makes a difference whether God exists, a difference to him, to his life, to his future, then it makes no difference to him whether you argue intelligently or unintelligently about whether God exists. Because he doesn't care, because it doesn't matter to him. That used to not be the situation, because people almost intrinsically knew, yeah, it makes a difference. But they were brought up in a whole different society, whether Catholic or Protestant or unbeliever. And so even the unbeliever of, say, a century ago knew the question, does God exist, is a fundamental question, maybe the fundamental question. And he had to deal with it. He had to give a reason for the lack of faith that was in him, to modify a line from St. Peter. But he felt obligated to do that because he knew the question was important to him.
Right.
And nowadays, most people don't even realize that things are important for them or for anybody else. And so it's much more difficult now to carry on an intelligent discussion with people on religious issues because mostly they don't care. They have no interest.
Does she ask or point out ideas as to why there was that change from one generation to the other?
No doubt there'd be multiple factors, as there always are in these things.
Yeah.
One is I would call, certainly in the United States, but probably in Europe too, the progressive stupidification of the public. People are simply worse educated than they were a few generations ago, a few decades ago even. Mm-hmm. The late Joe Sobran, the columnist, said maybe 20 years ago, he said, a century ago, they taught Latin and Greek in high school. Today, they teach remedial English in college. Now, human nature hadn't changed in a century. People were not intrinsically smarter a century ago compared to today. But there's been a lesser and lesser attempt to instill knowledge and therefore ultimately wisdom in young people. And that carries over, of course, into their adulthood. So you've got people who might be entertained or at least kept busy or occupied during their school years, but fewer and fewer of them actually come away with much learning. And when you have a populace that doesn't even get the basics, then once they're adults, it's very difficult to get them interested in any real subject because they don't know real subjects exist, and if they did, they wouldn't know how to deal with them. They don't have the tools, the mental, intellectual tools to discuss, to learn, to argue about things.
Yeah, very good. Well, here's the music coming up. We are chatting with Karl Keating about Frank Sheeds' work, Faith Comes by Hearing. Stay tuned, folks. A lot more to come on the other side of the break. You're listening to Hands on Apologetics.
Help the Helpless, a Minnesota St. Paul nonprofit organization chaired by Father of Tyr and volunteers, is humbly asking you for your kind support to help the poor and the handicapped children in India and Ecuador. Through financial support from the Help of the Helpless benefactors, the children are provided with clothing, food, education, shelter, and the teachings of the Catholic Church. The mission is to help children thrive and become self-sufficient young adults leading productive lives. We also provide aid to poor families in Ecuador with food baskets, medicines, medical assistance, and help with funeral needs for the deceased. The work in India is done by Father Antonio's organization, St. Mary's. In Ecuador, the work is being done by the Servant Sisters of the Home of Mother. You can call us at 877-762-8857. To learn more, please visit our website, www.helpthehelpless.org. God bless you. Buying or selling your home or your business property? This is Terry Barber. Real Estate for Life underwrites the Terry and Jesse Show. And they can connect you to one of 900 pro-life real estate agents around the world. And when they receive their referral fee, they will give 80% of it to a pro-life organization. Wow! That's 80%! realestateforlife.org, 877-LIFE-US1.
Now, back to Hands-on Apologetics with Gary Machuda. If you'd like to join the conversation, call 888-526-2151. Here's Gary.
And welcome back, everybody. We're chatting with Karl Keating about Frank Sheeds' work, Faith Comes by Hearing. And before we get into the particulars of the book, Karl, what you were saying is very interesting because looking back, like time of Socrates and Plato, it was understood that leisure made possible philosophy, because if you're a slave, obviously you can't be thinking about ultimate causes. You're trying to put bread on the table. And yet you have this strange phenomenon in the 20s, 30s, and 40s where life was hard, and yet people were so earnest about the big questions. Now we're drowning in leisure, and no one cares about these things. It's just odd.
There was Frank and Maisie's close friend, Louisa Cousins, whom we've mentioned before on this show, who wrote a single book, but about heresies in the church and their history. And she wrote the book by coming over to the apartment where Frank Sheed and Maisie Ward lived, and would use their kitchen table because she had no place of her own to write. And so her Handbook of Heresies was produced that way. And Sheed said that Louisa Cousins had the most subtle theological mind he had never come across, and yet she earned her daily bread by scrubbing floors. She was very poor, but she had a brilliant mind. And so poverty didn't stop her from becoming brilliant, even though she wasn't able to produce probably the other books that would certainly have been in her, but she did produce one fine book. And yet now, we're about a century almost past that time. Now we have, even among poorer Americans, a level of wealth and comfort unknown to Louisa Cousins. And yet there's almost a complete lack of interest in the intellectual life. Part of this is inculcated through a poor schooling system, and part through poor parentage, where parents who aren't interested in thinking pass along the notion to their children that thinking is not important, and that perpetuates. So we've got that situation, and that's simply the world we're in now. We're in a rich world where information can be passed almost effortlessly, but even information, it doesn't go very far. T.S. Eliot, in one of his poems, asked the question, where is the knowledge we've lost in information? Where is the wisdom we have lost in knowledge? Information is just raw data. Putting it together to mean something, that's knowledge. But then even then, you have to take knowledge and chew on it and look at it and work with it for it to become wisdom. So, where's the wisdom we've lost in knowledge? Where's the knowledge we've lost in information? Asked Eliot. And so we're a very rich society with lots of information, especially, including things religious. And yet very few people have wisdom in those areas, where a century ago so many more seemed to have wisdom.
Yes. Yeah, very good. So Frank Sheed acknowledged this shift in the audience. So what did he tweak from the Catholic evidence outlines in this book to make up for that change?
Well, Catholic evidence training outlines more emphasized how to argue the truth or falsity of a particular proposition. Mm-hmm. This book, Faith Comes by Hearing, emphasizes more explaining what that proposition is. So the subject matters are pretty much the same. For example, going down the table of contents, we've got the Blessed Trinity, the man Christ Jesus, Christ is God, supernatural life, salvation, conscience, Our Lady, prayer, the sacramental principle, so much more. Basically the same topics as in Catholic evidence training outlines, but where that one was almost taken for granted that both sides knew what we meant by such and so. This book more emphasizes how to explain what we mean by this term in the first place. So there's somewhat less emphasis here on how then to argue about it, more on what it is we're arguing about or preparing to argue about. And as he begins this book, he said, you can't argue God's existence unless you first really define what you mean by God. Because if you argue with an atheist, say, even one of these lazy modern atheists who's never really studied atheism itself, but just sort of rejects God, he's going to have in his mind some weird notion of what you mean by God when you utter the word. You've got to transfer to his mind what you really mean by that term, what you really understand God to be. And until you get that done, it doesn't make any sense. It's a waste of time for you to start proving that God exists. Because he's going to have in mind, if you start the proof right away, he'll have in mind, this is what you mean by God when it has no relation to what you mean. See? And that's the same for all these other things. What's salvation? What's the church? What's the sacrament? What's forgiveness? What's the purpose of suffering? All those kinds of things, says Sheed in Faith Comes by Hearing, all those things need to be defined in a way today that they didn't need to be so defined a lifetime ago, because the generality of people in America had a sense of what was being talked about. They might disagree, they certainly did disagree, but they basically knew what you meant by salvation or a sacrament or what have you. And now, because of so many cultural and educational forces and anti-forces, that underlying knowledge is not there. So it's a much more difficult thing, because it's almost like taking a 40-year-old child and trying to answer its basic questions, which, what for? What's that, mommy, daddy?
Right.
The young child knows nothing. And you've got to explain, and of course it is level, what these things are. But you're almost doing the same kind of thing with grown-ups now. I mean, you're going to have to do that in order to have an intelligent conversation about any of these topics.
Yeah, great point. Very good point. Like an atheist, they might think of God as some elderly bearded gentleman that lives in the sky that throws thunderbolts and or is angry when people have a good time.
One of these hero figures like a Superman or Spider-Man or somebody, or they have some goofy Scientologist kind of view that it's a extraterrestrial coming in, and planting humanity on the earth, whatever. Okay, but all of their conceptions of God would really be nothing but strong or clever men, Superman, right? Mm-hmm. And so they're not starting with a concept of God that you can prove, because they think you're proving something that you're not trying to prove. So your proof isn't going to work, whatever that might be, until they understand what you mean by the term. And that goes through all religious stuff, because the religious sense, although it never can be eradicated from people, because it's a basic instinct in human nature, which a true instinct, because it relates to a reality that's actually beyond human nature. Mm-hmm. That instinct is always there, but it can be misinterpreted widely, and nowadays it is. So you no longer can rely as a Catholic apologist or just as a regular Catholic on assuming that people around you share with you basic understandings of reality, both material and spiritual. They don't. And so whatever you're talking about Sheeds says in this book, you're going to have to start off from scratch. And that makes it harder, more frustrating, but also potentially more fruitful.
Yeah.
Because if you can then enlighten a few people on a few of these issues, suddenly a light will go on for them, and they say, because they're looking at something here that has a depth and a solidity and a comprehensiveness that they had never come across in anything else before. I mean, if you can, for example, truly define for them what you mean by the term God, and then prove it to them so they accept it, that will be the one thing in their minds that stands out from everything else, because just the whole substance and structure of the argument, of the thought about this, is different from this weak, amorphous sense that they've got of things in general. And once you can excite people that way, and they will be excited once they get to that point, they can move on to other things. You know, and I've seen this, especially with young people, that they will come to realize, I've been shortchanged in my education, yes, but also in the general society around me. There is much more to understand. There is much more that I could have known by this point. And now I've got work to do. I've got homework to do. I've got to catch up, and I've got to do it on my own, because there's basically nobody out there who's going to help me, because if there were, they would have helped me already. I wouldn't have been in this spot of relative ignorance. Okay?
Right.
So in a way, we're in a much harder position as apologists than we had been 50 or 100 years ago. But in another way, once we get a few of these things across to people, the engine sort of runs on its own. And they can go do the work. We don't have to walk them through everything after that, because they'll be so excited about seeing some things in a whole new way, whole new depth of understanding, that excitement will carry them a long ways.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Well, Karl, the hour is flowing. Where can people go to maybe pick up Frank Sheeds' work, and where can they go to get your stuff as well?
I think this particular book of Sheed may still be available at Amazon. It might only, I don't know if it's still as a new book, or it'd have to be a used one at this point. I haven't checked. And for my own books, go to Amazon, search on my name, and the list of them will come up.
Excellent. Very good. Well, thank you so much for coming on the program. I appreciate it.
Gary, it's always a delight to be with you. Thanks.
All right. And that's Karl Keating, ladies and gentlemen. And please do, check out his stuff, karlkeating.com, or just go on Amazon and type in Karl Keating, and it'll give you a list of all his great works, not only in apologetics, but also a lot of other fun genres as well. And boy, time flies when you're having fun, and that was a great conversation with Karl. But never fear, because High Impact Catholic Talk will soon be here with the Terry and Jesse show. And it's time for me to shut down the Midwest Command Center here and turn off the dojo lights. Thank you so much for tuning in. We truly appreciate it. And God willing, we'll be back again tomorrow to do this thing that we call Hands-On Apologetics. Bye-bye, everybody. Have a great day.
In the 1990s, I lived and worked in Hollywood. But when my wife Betty's mom took ill, we relocated to Orange County. And it was during this time in our lives that I converted to Catholicism. Once my eyes were opened to the truth, I couldn't learn enough about the faith. But I had less free time than ever, especially with a long commute. That's when I discovered the real value of Catholic audio. Listening to cassette tapes transformed my daily commute into a miniature retreat. And that's the beauty of Virgin Most Powerful Radio today. Since the podcasts are archived, you can listen anytime on our smartphone app. I know how listening to Catholic audio can bring you closer to Christ and His Church. So I encourage you to visit the App Store or go to vmpr.org and download the app today. It just might change your life. I'm Matthew Arnold for Virgin Most Powerful Radio.